Welcome back. Thanks for joining us again. We're at session 2, which is our Explained session on content that's harmful to children. You are going to hear a lot today and in your compliance activities about priority content, and non-designated content. They're difficult labels to understand, so we've really tried to break them down in this session, and we've got a big focus on the evidence of our understanding of how each content happens online and how children are affected. So I'll hand you over to our experts for this session, starting with Lizzie. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and welcome to this morning's second session, where we will be diving into the detail of the regulation and what you need to know as the children's safety duties start to come into force. So for the next hour, we will be focusing on the kinds of content that we are seeking to protect children from. Just to briefly introduce myself, I'm Lizzie, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Sophie and Amy from the Protection of Children team, to talk you through what we mean by content harmful to children. So this is a quick overview of what we're going to tick off in this morning's session. So to start off, I'll briefly give you an overview of the legal framework and the definitions in the Online Safety Act on content harmful to children. Then I'll take you through the overarching risk and harms duties and explain 3 key documents which we've published to support industry to both identify and assess risks to children and also understand what types of content might be harmful. Then I'll hand over to Amy and Sophie, who will talk you through each of the 8 categories of content harmful to children set out in the Act, including how we've defined each type of harm and some key risk factors that might influence children's experiences on those services. Just a brief note before we get started, that particularly during the harm by harm breakdown, we will be having some more detailed discussion of some potentially distressing topics like suicide content and self-harm content. So feel free to drop off at that point and rejoin us 15 minutes later. So to briefly set the scene, why this session matters, and to explain a bit more about why we've decided to structure this session harm by harm. Understanding each type of harmful content, including both the causes and impacts of harm to children and how to identify harmful content, is really fundamental and the first step in the process to meet the other duties under the Online Safety Act. You'll need to understand these harms to firstly assess the risk of each type of harmful content on your service, and then to design your community guidelines, and lastly, respond to complaints about these types of content and take content moderation decisions. So with all that in mind, what do we mean when we talk about content harmful to children? So many of you will already be aware that the Online Safety Act confers a higher degree of protection for children than it does for adults. This means that in addition to the illegal content duties, providers also have additional duties to keep children safe from content that might harm them. In practice, this means, firstly, providers will need to have systems in place to prevent children from encountering the most types of harmful content. Providers will also have to take steps to protect children in an age-appropriate way from other types of harm. It's important to note at this point that the Act doesn't differentiate or define prevent and protect, but in general terms, preventing children from encountering the most types of harmful content means that a child should not come across it when they're using the service, whereas protecting children, generally speaking, requires a service to take action to reduce the risk of children encountering types of harmful content, and the codes team will explain in more detail later on this morning about those types of actions. So in more granular terms, the Act specifies that there are 3 types of harmful content. The first is primary priority content, which is classified as the most severe type of content harmful to children, and includes suicide content, self-harm content, eating disorder content, and online pornography. And just as a reminder, services are required to prevent children of any age encountering PPC. The next type of content is priority content, which is listed. There are various types of harm listed out in the Act, which we've grouped into 5 categories, which are abuse and hate content, bullying content, violent content, harmful substances, and dangerous stunts and challenges content. As a reminder, services are required to protect children in age groups judged to be at risk of harm from these types of content. And in just a minute, Amy and Sophie will talk you through the definitions of each type of PPC and PC listed on the slide. And finally, a third type of harmful content is defined in the Online Safety Act, which is non-designated content, or NDC. We will say lots more about NDC at the end of this session, but in simple terms, this is defined as content which doesn't fall under the categories of PPC or PC, which are listed out in the pink and green boxes on the left-hand side, but which still present a material risk of significant harm to an appreciable number of children. We've developed a framework for identifying and assessing NDC, and using the framework, we've identified 2 categories of NDC, which are depression content and body stigma content, and there'll be more detail on that later on in the session. So lastly, on the scene setting, before I hand over to Amy and Sophie to talk you through the details, I'll briefly just touch on what you need to know about the risk and harm duties under the Online Safety Act. So to recap from earlier this morning, this is a very simple overview of the duties that are now expected of regulated services. This includes first carrying out a children's access assessment, followed by a children's risk assessment, and then implementation of safety measures to keep children safe on services. And as already mentioned, this is a cyclical process, so providers are expected to keep their risks under constant review. This session and the one following are more squarely focused on the second step in this process, the children's risk assessment, and on the documents that we've published to support services to carry out their assessment of risks to children. So firstly, the Children's Register of Risks is our sector-wide analysis of the risks of harm to children on regulated services. This document can be used as reference material for services producing their children's risk assessments. The Children's Register of Risks informs the risk factors that are set out in our children's risk profiles, which distill the key risk factors identified in the Register of Risks. And it is a requirement under the Online Safety Act for services to consult the children's risk profiles when they carry out their own assessments. The risk profiles form part of the Children's Risk Assessment Guidance, which is our 4-step framework for services to follow when they're carrying out their own children's risk assessments. And you'll have a full session on this guidance after this session. And finally, the guidance on content harmful to children sets out examples of what Ofcom deems to be or not to be content harmful to children per the definitions in the Online Safety Act. And again, you'll have more on that in just a moment. So to recap, the 3 documents we'll present this morning are the Children's Register of Risks, the Children's Risk Assessment Guidance and Children's Risk Profiles, and the guidance on content harmful to children. Each of these are available in full on our website, but just briefly, I'll pass to Amy to talk you through the Children's Register of Risks.
Thanks very much, Lizzie. So the Children's Register of Risks, this is our sector-wide assessment of the causes and impacts of harm to children online. It's based on quality-assured evidence from a range of sources, including Ofcom's own research, evidence from government, academia, industry and civil society, and it comprises around 550 individual research sources. So it's a comprehensive evidence repository of evidence and analysis, and we encourage service providers to consult this when conducting your own risk assessments. So the register is structured by each type of harm as listed in the Act. And in each section, we start by defining the harm type, such as eating disorder content, and cover off any key considerations. Then we go on to talk about how the harm manifests online. So this is where that eating disorder content can be found online, how prevalent it is, and how children can be impacted by it. We then present the evidence for the risk factors that we've identified could affect the risk of exposure to that harmful content, and these include user base, so which demographics or characteristics, such as a child's age or gender, could make them more at risk of exposure. Service types, so which types of services has this content been found on? Functionalities, so which features or functionalities of a service, such as live streaming or content recommender systems, could affect the risk of exposure to that content. And finally, business models, so which business models of a service could play a role in increasing the risk that that content reaches children. The register informs our risk profiles, so I'll hand back to Lizzie to tell you about that.
Thank you. Yes, so the children's risk profiles are resources which services must consult when they're conducting their own children's risk assessment, and that's a duty under the Online Safety Act. The children's risk profiles are made up of a list of the different factors which we identified and assessed in the Children's Register of Risks, and will be updated when necessary as changes are made to the Children's Register. The children's risk profiles should very much be seen as the starting point in the 4-step children's risk assessment process. They're really designed to help you understand which kinds of content are harmful to children and which types of content are most likely to be encountered by children on a service like yours, and the types of factors which are likely to play a role. You'll hear more about the broader children's risk assessment process in the session later today, but I'll just hand over to Sophie to talk to you about the children's harm guidance.
Thanks, Lizzie. So the guidance on content harmful to children, or harms guidance for short, is guidance for Part 3 services likely to be accessed by children. So this includes user-to-user and search services. The guidance is intended to support services in making judgments about whether the content on their service meets the definition of PC and PPC in the Act, and therefore inform if and how codes measures might apply. We're really conscious of the complexity and the inevitable degree of subjectivity with making these kinds of judgments. And so the structure you see in the box on the right of the slide has been designed to provide both clarity and flexibility where necessary. So, for example, we know that there are many cases where it may not be immediately clear whether content meets the definition of content harmful to children or not. Therefore, for each harm, we've included contextual information to help services with content that may be context-specific or just generally more borderline in nature. Again, to provide clarity, we've defined key terms for each kind of harmful content. We also know that content harmful to children can be closely linked to kinds of illegal content. So for each harm, we identify relevant or related illegal harms and signpost to relevant parts of the illegal content judgment guidance, which you can find in our statement on illegal content. And this is to support understanding of legal thresholds. We've approached these examples with the acknowledgement that there's a huge range of potential kinds of content across service types. So we've therefore focused on providing a non-exhaustive list of illustrative examples that are by no means comprehensive, but really intended to capture the range of examples relevant to multiple service types. Finally, we're also highly aware of the need to balance safety with user rights, such as freedom of expression. And in the introduction, we include a rights assessment that explains our duties relating to human rights and identifies forms of speech that require careful consideration, such as journalistic, artistic, or educational content. And then we use illustrative examples throughout the guidance, and particularly examples of content that we don't consider to be PC or PPC, to set out some circumstances in which these kinds of content may or may not meet the definition of content harmful to children. So we're now going to give a quick overview of each kind of PPC and PC, focusing on how we've defined each kind of content in our guidance, and the and just pulling out a couple of risk factors that we've identified in our risk register. But before we go into each kind of harmful, and also this is the point that if you feel like you want to step away because of discussions of suicide, self-harm, or eating disorders or other sensitive topics, please, this is the section. But But yeah, before we go into each kind of harmful content, we just wanted to flag a few things to consider across harms. Firstly, we're only talking about user-generated content here. This is defined in the Act as content that is generated, uploaded, or shared by a user of a service, and that may be then encountered by another user by means of the service. Sorry, too many. Also excluded from this definition is news publisher content, i.e. content from a recognised news publisher. This is not subject to safety duties about protecting children. And as I mentioned earlier, any examples that we would consider to be in legal content have not been included. We also just want to flag here as well that because this guidance is about whether content meets the definition set out in the Act, there may be content that is not covered in the guidance, but nevertheless we consider might be considered harmful, such as content that is harmful to younger children. And yeah, as I just mentioned, for each harm, to kind of provide more clarity where possible, we define key terms for each harm, and these include harm-specific words and terminology, but also commonly used terms that come up repeatedly in the definitions of kinds of harmful content. Just to flag, these definitions do vary slightly in the context of each harm, but generally we consider that promotes means any content that publicizes, supports, recommends, glamorizes, glorifies, or romanticizes harmful acts, encourages to refer to content that could persuade others to harmful acts, sometimes unintentionally, and to provide instructions means content that describes methods in sufficient detail for them to be emulated. And we've just included a snapshot of what the guidance actually looks like, and this is for pornographic content, because we just wanted to show you how we've presented the examples and kind of the level of detail that you can find there. We've generally included a few different types of content under each content description, with content examples that further illustrate what we mean. So we'll now provide a quick summary of our guidance for each kind of harmful content, and we'll pull out some examples, but we really recommend going back to the guidance itself, which is a lot more detailed, to see the kind of full extent of our contextual factors that we've provided and examples. And as I said, we'll pull out a couple of risk factors from the risk register, but again, we direct you to the register of risk, which has a much more comprehensive analysis. So first, pornographic content. And as a reminder, this is PPC, which means primary priority content that services must take steps to prevent all children from encountering. And the Act defines pornographic content as content that it is reasonable to assume was produced solely or principally for the purpose of sexual arousal. To understand whether content meets this definition, services should consider the presence or combination of different elements that might indicate the content is primary purpose sexual arousal. These elements include things like nudity, language strongly associated with porn or strong sexual references. Services should also look at the material holistically. For example, an individual might be fully clothed but simulating sexual activity, which we would not likely to be considered pornographic, whereas an individual using pornographic language while clothed and not simulating sexual activity would likely not be considered pornographic. And in the guidance, there's loads more detail about how services should consider clips from other forms of media, like broadcast TV, when that content is reshared by users online. And we also cover the inclusion of AI-generated or synthetic media. But to pull out a couple of examples, we consider explicit depictions of sexual activity, such as depictions of masturbation, penetration, or ejaculation to be pornographic content, as well as fetish material. And we do not consider partial or full nudity in a sexual context to be pornographic, or content where any nudity or sexual activity is secondary to the dramatic or comedic purpose.
And then just to give you an idea of the risk factors that we identified in the Children's Register of Risks, the register presents the evidence of the impact on children's attitudes, psychology and behaviour as a result of viewing the pornographic content. So, for example, we reference studies exploring how the normalisation of violent sexual behaviours could impact children's attitudes to sex and relationships. We identified 12 risk factors in our register of risks. So we've just put a couple of examples up there. But for example, evidence suggests that pornographic content is prevalent on social media services, as well as pornography services. and that one route to exposure for children is being sent hyperlinks of pornography from their peers or from strangers via group chats.
Thanks, Amy. So yeah, on to suicide content now. And suicide content is defined in the Act as content which encourages, promotes, or provides instructions for suicide. Services should carefully consider how to protect children's access to safety-promoting information, while acknowledging that some recovery-focused content can nevertheless contain characteristics which may be considered harmful to children. Another kind of contextual factor we highlight is that while artistic formats may attract a higher degree of protection, services should also consider whether some artistic representations of suicide are actually, in fact, romanticizing or glamorizing suicide and nevertheless would meet the definition of harmful suicide content. So examples include content describing a method of suicide as harmful content or suicide-related challenges, while we would not consider brief descriptions or mentions of suicide or content discussing an individual's experiences as harmful suicide content. Self-harm content is similar to suicide in a lot of ways in terms of how it manifests online. The definition, again, focuses on encouraging, promoting, and providing instructions. And the contextual factors are broadly similar to what I just outlined for suicide content. Examples, again, include any instructions, methods, or images of real-life self-harm, whereas we would not consider healed scars or content discussing safe ways to deal with negative emotions or feelings of wanting to self-harm to meet the definition of harmful self-harm content.
And then in the register of risks, we identified 16 risk factors for suicide and self-harm content. And one of these is discussion forums and chat rooms. So these are spaces that can be used to share graphic images or detailed information on methods, or act as spaces where self-harm and suicidal behaviours are intentionally encouraged. One dedicated discussion forum has been linked to at least 50 UK deaths, with the youngest individual being age 17.
Thanks, Amy. So yeah, on to eating disorder content now. Eating disorder content is defined in the Act as content encouraging, promoting, or providing instructions for an eating disorder or behaviours associated with an eating disorder. While assessing this content, services should consider what behaviours associated with an eating disorder might look like for different groups. Services should also consider what genuinely recovery-promoting content is and how to protect access to that, while again identifying characteristics that are harmful regardless of context. So, for example, evidence that shows images of emaciation, even in a sort of before and after style post about an individual's recovery, can be detrimental to children. Some examples that we consider to be harmful eating disorder content include images or videos of emaciation or any instructions for carrying out eating disorders. In contrast, we would not consider content on research, awareness, advocacy, or support to be harmful eating disorder content.
And of the 15 risk factors we identified for eating disorder content, an example again is discussion forums and chat room services. And that's because these are spaces in which children can encounter eating disorder content with little moderation. Pro eating disorder websites and blogs often contain these forums where you can find information about maintaining an eating disorder, join group fasts, and be paired with an online user who can encourage your disordered behaviours. And these forums can pose particular risks because some of these contain eating disorder content that can be intentionally disguised as recovery content. So this disguising can risk the harmful content not being captured properly by moderation, but it also puts users who are actually seeking recovery content at risk of being unintentionally exposed to harmful content.
Thanks, Amy. So on to kinds of priority content now, or PC for short. So due to the similarities in how they manifest, we generally discuss abuse and hate content together. However, they do differ slightly in their definition and ultimately do need to be assessed separately. Abuse content is content which is abusive and targets the characteristics of race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, disability, and gender reassignment. whereas hate content is specifically content which incites hatred against, based on those listed characteristics. There are a number of contextual factors for services to consider with these harms. For example, abuse and hate should be assessed by its impact and not the intention of the poster, meaning service providers should consider how and where that content is being shared and who it's being directed at. Services should also consider substitute terms or symbols which might be used to evade content moderation, but nevertheless have derogatory and harmful intentions. We consider content such as insulting or intimidating remarks or stereotypes to be abuse, while content that repeats harmful or discriminatory ideas about another group in order to encourage others to share their beliefs would fall under content inciting hatred. For some examples that we don't consider to be abuse and hate content, that we include counter-speech, educational content, and any personal accounts of abuse or hatred.
And one example risk factor we identified is live streaming, because this can be used to broadcast hateful content to large audiences. And the ephemeral nature of live streams can make moderation challenging. That's because the content's less likely to be archived. There's evidence that live streams can be targeted by people who share hateful and abusive content with content creators and their audience. So research has identified instances where a stream can be targeted by a hate raid, featuring abusive content, targeting characteristics such as race or sexuality. So this means that children who are content creators or children who are viewing a live stream can be unexpectedly subjected to hate and abuse when using this functionality.
Thanks, Amy. So yeah, bullying content, and this is defined in the Act as content targeted against a person which conveys a serious threat, is humiliating or degrading, or forms part of a campaign of mistreatment. Bullying content is, of all the harms, particularly context dependent, so services really need to think about what kind of contextual factors they're drawing on to make judgments about this kind of content. For example, they should consider what context might indicate that a piece of content is part of a wider campaign of mistreatment and therefore may constitute bullying. This may include reviewing information provided by a user as part of a complaint or via reporting, as well as the frequency or number of users that are targeting the user in question. Generally, we would consider serious threats, aggressive behavior, or group humiliation or harassment to be clear examples of harmful bullying content, whereas content raising awareness of bullying or depictions of bullying would not be.
And again, there's lots of risk factors associated with bullying content. One example is the use of anonymous user profiles. So these can make it easier for people to engage in bullying behavior. And one reason for this might be that anonymity can enable a person to dissociate themselves from that bullying activity. Ofcom research found that communicating from behind a screen made it easier for people to make comments that they wouldn't usually make in circumstances where they would be held accountable. We also found that anonymity can worsen the impact of the bullying, and that's because mitigation measures might be less effective, or not knowing who is involved in the bullying could exacerbate children's anxiety.
Thanks, Amy. So onto violent content. There's three more. And there are three kinds of priority content which we have considered together under the umbrella term of violent content. These are content which encourages, promotes, or provides instructions for an act of serious violence against a person, content which depicts real or realistic serious violence or serious injury against a person in graphic detail, content that depicts real or realistic serious violence against an animal or fictional creature. And while we've assessed these together, services will need to consider these separately in their risk assessments. When identifying violent content, services should consider various contextual factors. For example, even some journalistic content that's depicting violence may be considered harmful to children, perhaps without suitable context, or where the image is very graphic and zoomed in. Moreover, understanding the degree to which content encourages or promotes violence can be reliant on an understanding of local events, social dynamics, or local identities. And there's also lots more detail in the harms guidance on gameplay and the context it might be considered harmful violent content. And we've got this is one where I think definitely the detail is in the section itself. But to pull out a couple of examples here, these include promoting or glamorizing the carrying of weapons, or depicting multiple people beating up an individual. In contrast, we would not consider content that depicts violence without encouraging it, professional or licensed sports, or charitable or animal welfare content to be harmful, violent content.
And one risk factor we identified for violent content, as well as for lots of other different types of harm, is content recommender systems. So services that employ these, it might heighten the risk that children may encounter the content without intentionally seeking it out. So in Ofcom research, children said that they felt they had no control over the content that they were seeing, and they felt that seeing violent content was therefore inevitable. And there are cases where users have uploaded videos with violent themes featuring popular cartoon characters, and this carries the risk of recommender systems presenting this harmful content to younger children. One study, for example, estimated that there was a 45% chance that a toddler who starts watching non-disturbing videos could then be recommended inappropriate ones within 10 recommendations.
Thanks, Amy. So yeah, on to harmful substances content. The Act defines this as content which encourages a person to ingest, inject or inhale, or in any other way self-administer a physically harmful substance, or a substance in a quantity such as to be physically harmful. When identifying harmful content, services should consider whether content actively or expressly encourages use. So this is likely to include like a recommendation or a call to action. And we call out here that content depicting substance use may not meet the definition of harmful substances content, but nevertheless be unsuitable for children in different age groups. And we also provide in the guidance some further information on content which is offering harmful substances for sale, such as tobacco and alcohol products. Examples include content encouraging consumption of illegal drugs, psychoactive substances, excessive use of age-restricted substances, or any kind of harmful substances not intended for human consumption. Whereas in examples we would not consider to be harmful substances content include journalistic content referencing drugs, or any kind of appropriate medical advice from reputable or accredited sources.
And one example we identified of a risk factor for harmful substances is hashtags. So hashtags can be used to direct users, including children, to content promoting harmful substances. For example, posts that are promoting herbal or natural abortion methods have been found to use code words, deliberate misspellings, and the replacement of letters with special characters or numbers. And this is to avoid detection by automated content moderation systems.
Thanks, Amy. So yeah, final harm, dangerous stunts and challenges content. And this is defined as content which encourages, promotes, or provides instructions for a challenge, stunt, that is highly likely to result in serious injury to the person who does it or to someone else. When identifying this content, services should consider context, such as whether stunts are instructive or being encouraged, and evaluate the risk to children specifically. Content warnings may also be relevant as contextual factors. However, services should be aware that these content warnings often serve to reduce personal liability and may actually be insufficient to mitigate the risk of harm if the content contains other features that encourage children to enact stunts and challenges, or sometimes don't try this at home is not enough. Examples include encouraging others to emulate stunts carried out by professionals that could cause serious injury if emulated. And examples considered not to be dangerous stunts and challenges content would be challenges where there's no risk of serious injury or where the risk of being encouraged is low.
And in terms of risk factors, we identified social media and video sharing services as a risk factor. So evidence suggests that children are likely to encounter online challenges on these services. A survey of teenagers found that 83% had become aware of the online challenges via social media. And the outcomes of participating in these challenges can often be severe, even fatal. For example, a viral challenge directed children and teens to record themselves taking large amounts of diphenhydramine and publish the results on video sharing services.
Thanks, Amy. So just moving on now to our final section, which sets out our approach to identifying non-designated content. Non-designated content, or NDC for short, is described in the Act as a kind of content not covered by PC or PC, so any of the harms we've just discussed, that presents a material risk of significant harm to an appreciable number of children. In terms of duties, service providers need to assess NDC as part of their children's risk assessment, and Ofcom is also required to do this as part of their own risk assessment. And throughout this process, we have identified two kinds of content which we consider to be NDC, which we refer to as depression content and body stigma content. And service providers should consider both these kinds of content in their risk assessment, along with any other kinds of NDC that Ofcom has not identified. And look, we also acknowledge that this definition is quite challenging. So when doing our own risk assessment, we found it helpful to break down this definition, and we've created a framework that first kind of scopes a potential kind of NDC, then assesses the kind of content against different parts of that quite long definition. First, material risk of significant harm, and then affecting an appreciable number of children. And this framework is not a statutory requirement, but demonstrates how Ofcom has approached identifying NDC, and we expect it to be useful to services also when filling out their duties. So we'll quickly talk through that framework, and then we'll just show how we've used it to identify two kinds of NDC. So step one is about identifying a kind of potentially harmful content to then kind of run through the rest of the framework and test against the definition. And we've kind of first sought to detect kinds of harmful content by speaking with children, parents, practitioners, or experts to really understand what kinds of content, aside from PC and PPC, are being reported as causing harm to children. And it's just important to note here that when we talk about harm, we're using the Act's definition of harm, in that harm can be physical or psychological, but it also may be cumulative, i.e. from repeated encounters or harmful combinations of content, and it can also be indirect, so affecting someone who has not, as a result of another child encountering that content. And yeah, once we've got a provisional kind of harmful content to assess, we move to step two, to assess risk of significant harm by reviewing evidence that indicates a relationship between the significant harm and the specific kind of content. And in the statement, you can find details about how to assess significance, as well as guidance on evidence to use when establishing that relationship. We also assess material risk, which we consider to mean the likelihood of harm occurring. Once we've established that there's the material risk of significant harm, so that's the first part of the definition, we then assess whether an appreciable number of UK children are affected. Here we consider evidence relating to the reach or virality of that content, as well as the proportion of children with any demographic characteristics that present a risk of significant harm. And yeah, we generally found that this framework works best if used iteratively. So you sort of start with a provisional definition, but you may find by working through kind of steps 2 and 3 that the kind of content you initially scoped was too broad or incorrect, in which case you can sort of go back to the start, rescope it, and then based on the evidence and kind of run through the steps again. And yeah, again, this framework is set out in a lot more detail in the statement itself. But yeah, using this framework, we've identified two kinds of NDC in our risk assessment. Both of these kinds of content, again, there's a lot more detail in the register of risks as well as, primarily it sits in the register of risks, actually. We're quite short on time, so we're going to run through these pretty quickly. But first, kind of content we identified was depression content, which is a shorthand for content that promotes depression, hopelessness, and despair. And we initially detected this by identifying that there was a kind of content relating to mental health not covered by suicide or self-harm content that children and practitioners and parents reported to us as causing harm. While different mental health conditions were mentioned, most of the evidence discussed depression or in the intense emotions around depression and how those mental conditions can be romanticized online. And we found that particularly in high volumes, depression content is linked to lasting or severe low mood, deteriorating mental health, suicidal ideation, stigmatization, and barriers to help seeking. And therefore, we included that there was material risk of significant harm. We also concluded that there was an appreciable number of children affected by looking at the fact that this content has a high reach among children, and also that children with existing mental health issues, which is approximately 1 in 5 children in the UK, were at particular risk of significant harm. And we consider examples to be kind of content romanticizing depression or feelings of despair, whereas examples that we might not consider would include any kind of content promoting recovery, information or support, or discussing real or lived experiences of depression. I'm going to skip through the risk factors just because we're a bit short on time. But on to the second kind of content, which is body stigma content, which is shorthand for content that shames or otherwise stigmatizes body types or physical features. Again, this came from a kind of insight around the fact that a lot of children report that they feel social media causes them to worry about their body image. And we also found evidence that body dissatisfaction is linked to several harmful physical and psychological outcomes, such as poor mental health, disordered eating behaviors, lower participation in education and sport, to name a few of those harms. The challenge then lay for us in isolating the kind of content linked to body dissatisfaction. So we provisionally focused the definition on negative comparison or content promoting shame and stigma. When we put this through the framework, we did find material risk of significant harm with high volumes of body stigma content linked to low self-esteem or psychological distress or disordered eating or exercise behaviors, often via experiences of body dissatisfaction. Evidence also shows that, again, this content has a high reach among UK children. It's very common. And also that children with body image issues represent a kind of appreciable portion of the UK and are at greatest risk of harm. Probably going to stop there just so we have enough time for questions. But again, yeah, see the guidance for all of our examples on those kinds of content. So handing over now to Ali, who's going to moderate some questions, I think.
Okay, thank you, team. I mean, what I think we can all tell from that presentation is that this is extremely complicated and challenging, and there's a lot to consider, and it's highly contextual. So we have made available lots of resources. We're going to refer to those throughout the day, but we're going to take some questions now in our first Q&A session, and as well as Amy, Sophie, and Lizzie will invite Almudena to join us back on the stage. A quick technical note before we start asking some of these questions. Some of you are still in the live feed for session 1. If you want to ask a question, you need to move over to session 2. So exit back to the main portal, join session 2, and then you can ask your questions. But we do have some that have come in already, and I can see that some upvoting is going on, and we'll try to prioritize those questions that have the most likes next to them. Okay. Thank you so much for sticking around for questions and for walking us through that presentation. The first one we have was submitted in advance, and it's about whether it's possible to have common ground on harmful content between different European countries. How do we overcome context, cultural differences, among other things? Now, that sounds like quite a challenging ask, given everything else that we've just walked through, but we know that international alignment is a big challenge for all online safety regulators and practitioners. Would anyone like to start us on that question about international alignment of definitions?
I'm happy to have a first go at it. And I acknowledge and realize that international alignment is very important. We often, throughout our guidance, talk about context, and context being very important driver of judging whether something is over the line or not when it comes to harmful judgments. So that context is culturally driven as well. So when we are asking companies to implement the Online Safety Act here in the UK, they need to take into account the contextual factors and cultural factors of children in the UK. And that includes also the diverse range of cultures that the UK has and how those manifest, and those can manifest and can amplify the harm for some children in some communities. Having said that, a lot of the ground is common. So if people take the register of risk or the harms guidance, there is a lot of commonality, and there is a lot of content where I think if you put 10 people from different countries to say thumbs up, thumbs down, whether they think it is harmful for children or not, I think you would come to quite a wide level of common understanding. At Ofcom, we also work with international partners. So we are very aligned to regulation in Europe, regulation in Australia, wider regulatory frameworks and requirements on services. We try to align as much as we can through that work. But at the end of the day, our duty is the implementation of the Online Safety Act in the UK.
Thank you. It reminds me as well of a point you made this morning, Almudena, which is that if online services are looking at our definitions of harmful content to inform their terms of service, to inform their systems and processes, this is a baseline. Mm-hmm. They might already have in place rules that go beyond what we're recommending in terms of certain content types that might be prohibited. So we're really looking to provide a baseline for those judgments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Indeed.
And just to build on that, I think we've really tried to design the guidance to have that balance of kind of consistency and then flexibility where necessary. So, for example, we acknowledge that attitudes towards nudity may vary across different cultures, which is why the definition of pornographic content hinges on that content being for the primary purpose of sexual arousal, and therefore, like partial or full nudity in a non-sexual context would unlikely be considered pornographic. So, just to provide an example there.
Yeah, thank you. We have a couple of questions on specific types of harmful content. I should probably start with a caveat that definitions are a very common question that we get across all of our sessions, and we will do our best to try and answer, but sometimes they haven't all been subject to the same type of policy process, and in some cases it's so contextual that there's got to be a degree of judgment for the services themselves, but we can set the framework. So the first one of these is about hate content. And the question is, do providers need to consider intent when it comes to hate content? For example, the use of or quoting of rap lyrics or reclaimed words could not have hate intent, but would likely include terms associated with hate. So I know we discussed hate in the presentation earlier. Sophie, I don't know if you can speak to intent as an important part of the definition.
So I think the point that we made earlier is that actually it's about the impact of the content rather than the intent of the poster. So I think, again, it's probably one where various contextual factors need to be taken into consideration. Like I think there's certain language which is likely to be considered harmful in any context. But with the question of reclaimed language, again, that might be a question about what is the impact of that particular post, who's it being shared to, and what is the likely impact of harm caused by that content, even if, the intent was...
And we're asking about harm to children in this case.
Indeed.
We're not asking about harm to all users. We're focused on children for the purposes of these regulations.
100%. And intent is one of the things that differentiates illegal content from harmful content. So for a lot of the illegal content categories in our illegal content judgment guide hinges on intent, and that is something that that services need to take into account. As Sophie was saying, when it comes to harmful content to children, the intent is not a relevant factor, is how that content is going to impact the child. And for that as well, services need to take into account not only the content, but how that content is presented to the child and the cumulative impact that that content can have in the context of the wider experience of the child.
Makes sense. So, for example, if we were talking about hateful content under the illegal harms regime, you would need to make some judgment about intent in order to conclude that that was illegal content. Mm-hmm. Here, there's a slightly lower bar, and we're looking at the impact on children and trying to set a higher standard of protection. Yeah. That makes sense. Thank you. We have a question about depression content, which I know we covered at the end under the non-designated content category. And depression content seems like a very subjective term, this question says. Could you give us examples of what would be considered such content? And I suspect we have some in the guidance, already some frames of reference.
Yes, we do. I mean, we don't actually include a full kind of harms guidance chapter on non-designated content because it is slightly different. You know, the duties are for us to make our own judgment on what we consider to meet the definition of non-designated content. Services then have to kind of consider those kinds of content, but there's, you know, it's ultimately on services to identify their own kinds of NDC on their service. And yeah, with depression content, it is, you know, it's one where we really identified that there was a kind of harm occurring around this content which didn't quite meet the definition of suicide and self-harm content. We've tried to define it, and we have focused on these ideas of kind of romanticizing, promoting, and that might be through certain visual elements or like combinations of visual elements with messaging that could be seen to be, particularly when encountered in high volumes, to be having the effect of kind of causing severe low mood or exasperating mental health conditions in children. We have been quite specific to really try and focus that definition on content that is kind of promoting and romanticizing rather than content that is individuals describing a lived experience, and therefore really hope to not interfere with kind of community building or solidarity communities that form online.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions. I think we've got 2 questions that relate to gaming services. So I'll group these together. When we're talking about user-to-user gaming services, so that might mean, and this question is doing a good job to point out some functionalities which might pull a gaming service into scope. In-game messaging, whether it's direct or group or via voice messaging, does user messaging such as, and apologies for the harmful content here, potentially, kill yourself or some description of you should hurt yourself, does that constitute suicide and self-harm content? Similarly, we have a question about violent content in a gaming context, noting that a lot of gaming involves fights and battles and something that's obviously violence. Can we say more about that? So I think a lot of this will depend on the context. With the violence question, I suspect is slightly easier to answer because it depends whether or not it's user-generated or not. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Correct. So the games will be subject to their own rating in terms of like the content that has been created for the purpose of the game. So that's not within the scope of our rules, and gaming providers will be very aware of the different ratings and how they apply. Our rules apply to content that is generated by the user. Going back down to the examples, I think a child receiving a message, you should kill yourself or go and kill yourself, is content that we would consider to be harmful. And it meets the definition of content that has been created by the user in this context.
Yeah. So we're looking there at the impact of the content as you were describing before, as opposed to the intent again. Yeah.
Yes. Indeed.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you very much. We have a really important question about peer support platforms. In that context, how do you distinguish between content which is sharing lived experiences, such as of depression, versus content which might be seen as romanticizing or encouraging certain behaviors? Is there anything we can say about how we distinguish between peer support and content that's harmful to children?
Go ahead.
So we acknowledge that it is difficult, and that's where, again, sort of those context-based decisions come in. We are aware that there are peer support platforms which have, tight moderation by mental health professionals, and in those instances, you would imagine that actually, if certain content characteristics, for example, like I named with eating disorders, and it's the same in kind of media guidelines, there are certain characteristics which, regardless of the context, can be sort of triggering or really harmful to children. Therefore, you would hope that if a peer support community was effectively moderated, a sort of image of emaciation, which was a before and after image, which we know is a harmful characteristic of a content, would be removed before it was kind of public on the platform. So I think we're not saying that peer support communities should be, we understand the value that they can play for children. I think it comes down to specifically what kind of content is being shared and whether they contain some of these characteristics which are generally pretty harmful to children.
But building on that and back to the intent, we also in the guidance acknowledge that even though, say, I might post something about my own personal experience and that has value and I might want to share that because it helps me in my process, actually that without the intent to harm a child, that actually can create a harmful experience for the child. So going back to what Sophie was saying, moderation within those communities that are high risk for children is very important, even though we are not saying that they should not exist or children should not be in them, but they should be benefiting from them, but in a way that is moderated and manages the risks.
And that's an important part of the risk assessment, which we're about to talk about, because you need to consider your business model, your user base, and all of those factors which will affect the risk level and the specific circumstances of your service. We have a question here about bullying content. And apologies, it's quite a long one. There's reference to allowing or not allowing comments on user-generated content. For platforms that exclusively offer peer-to-peer communication, such as forums, is it being suggested that those platforms are required to offer the ability to create content that has comment functionality removed? I think what's being asked here is whether we need to switch off comment functionalities for certain users. I think that's probably, again, a very contextual decision. And the point is that there are systems and processes in the round to make sure that children are protected from certain types of content should it appear on the platform.
100%. I would say not necessarily is the answer to that question, but I would encourage the service to really think about how children are using that functionality and what exposure is given them to harmful experiences and how it might amplify the risk. I think some of our proposals suggest that children should have the ability to switch off those content functionalities, but services should be encouraged to think as to whether they are appropriate and in what circumstances.
Yeah.
And just to clarify, did you want to come in on commenting on content as a risk factor?
We did identify that as a risk factor for bullying content, yes. But do you want to...
Yeah, but the fact that it's a risk factor doesn't mean that we say that no children should be able to use that functionality. It simply just signals that, that if you have that functionality, you need to explore the risk of bullying content.
Yeah.
And often steps to manage that risk.
Exactly.
Excellent. So yes, it's all about creating a safe environment, and that's just one factor, the presence of the functionality. Excellent. We just have one more question, and then we're at time. Is the definition of children under the Online Safety Act, does it also include vulnerable adults or consider vulnerable adults who are 18 to 25 who may also experience harm through online services? So I think that the definition of children does not include those groups. It's under 18s.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
But we would expect services that know they have vulnerable adults on their platform to consider that as part of their risk assessment, and whether that increases any of the risks that they have, either for illegal content or for content that's harmful to children. Is that right?
That's correct.
Good.
Yes.
Yeah.
The definition in the Act is very clear, is under 18s. And the only difference in the Act is around preventing all children when it comes to PPC, and the protect duty, which is a bit more nuanced and requires services to take into account children in different age categories. But but there is no provision for vulnerable adults.
No. Although in our register we do touch on vulnerability when it comes to under 18s, which is obviously a risk factor in lots of different ways when it comes to like socioeconomic factors, ethnicity, other kinds of things which might play a role in heightening or mitigating risks to children in different groups.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone on the panel. I think we've made it through all of the submitted questions. We will have a quick break and come back around 12:20. Please make sure you join session 3. So leave session 2 now and join session 3. That way you'll be able to submit your questions. And we will be talking through the risk assessment duties next. And in the meantime, thank you very much to everyone on the panel, and we hope to see you in a short while.
you.